Global Voices on Taiwan. Hi everyone, welcome to Global Voices on Taiwan. I'm your host again, Rath Wang. I'm a news producer and anchor. We have Yiting covering for Vincent today.
Hello, everyone. I'm Yiting from the Lien campaign and also a graduate student at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. We will explore how the latest news event from near and far impact Taiwan and how this island nation shakes the globe. We hope this podcast can be your window to Taiwan's global perspectives.
Our special guest is Chong. Ian is an expert in ASEAN, Taiwan, US, and China dynamics and is a political science professor at the National University of Singapore. He's written many analyses, including The Many One Chinas, Multiple Approaches to Taiwan and China, and he's a frequent speaker on CNN, the BBC, NBC, CNA of Singapore, and many, many more. And he is one of our many global experts, journalists, and policymakers on the podcast. Ian, being in Singapore, why is Taiwan so important to Southeast Asia? And how do you see ties between Taiwan and ASEAN growing?
Thanks for having me on. I add also that I'm a non-resident scholar at Carnegie China, under which the article you mentioned, Many One Chinas, was actually written and published. With Southeast Asia, it's actually quite interesting because I think Taiwan's importance underappreciated. On the one hand, we see Taiwan being a major trading partner, being a major investor in the region. It's usually within the top 10. In Singapore's case, I think it alternates between South Korea and Taiwan between 5 and 6, so just below actually the PRC. So there's the economic importance. Taiwan, of course, as everyone well knows, is very much integrated into the supply chain of the region. So a lot of components from Taiwan come to Southeast Asia. They get assembled and maybe sometimes sent on to the PRC for finishing into final products that will then be exported elsewhere. So Taiwan is very much part of our economic lives. For places that are more dependent on maritime trade, especially with Northeast Asia, a lot of the sea lanes will pass around Taiwan. A lot of the air routes will pass around Taiwan. And importantly, our very ability to have this podcast with me being in Singapore, and I guess you guys are in Taiwan, that rests on submarine cables that also traverse the South China Sea, going around Taiwan and into the East China Sea, and then across the Pacific. So Taiwan is a key node in a lot of the sort of daily life, but its importance is not really highlighted, not really understood. Part of the reason being that governments and to some degree populations, news organizations would prefer not to talk about Taiwan, given concerns that this could invite the ire of Beijing. Taiwan's clearly important. I'd also add a few more links that I personally think are interesting. If you think about the Aboriginal groups in Taiwan, the languages that they speak, they belong to the same Austronesian family as the Malay languages, which are widely spoken in Southeast Asia, Bahasa Indonesia, Javanese, Bahasa Malaysia, Tagalog. So they're all sort of related languages because of the way that migration worked historically. And also for places where there are ethnic Chinese communities. Historically, many of the ethnic Chinese communities in Southeast Asia come from the same places as the ethnic Chinese who migrated to Taiwan. So places in what is today southeastern China, notably Fujian and northern Guangdong. So many ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia, their families would see ancestry from places like Zhangzhou, Quanzhou, who also are the origins for some of the people who moved over to Taiwan.
I'm a Hakka myself, so I can completely relate to that.
That's fascinating. You've been writing extensively about PRC coercive efforts on Taiwan and its influence campaign in Southeast Asia. What exactly is that, and how can Taiwan do to best protect its democracy while maintaining peace in the entire region?
So the PRC, as they have become more capable, both economically and in terms of their ability to use force, that's also dovetailed with this increasing eagerness to pursue their claims with more vigor. So there is pressure, obviously, on Taiwan, given Beijing's desire to exert control over Taiwan and its population. That comes in the form of economic punishment sometimes. So the suspension of group tours to Taiwan some years back was one example. Limits on exports of Taiwan fruits and vegetables, that's another. So that sort of economic coercion, I mean, I generally study coercion, right? So Taiwan is a case of where you see quite a bit of PRC coercion, but it's not limited to Taiwan. If you look at this sort of arc from Northeast Asia through Southeast Asia, you see a fair amount of PRC coercive activity that comes in different flavors. There's the economic side. We see the pressure put on South Korea over their deployment of THAAD. So this included so much pressure on Lotte, the sort of food conglomerate, that they had to withdraw all their storefronts inside the PRC. We've seen pressure on Japan. Towards Southeast Asia, there was the suspension of the purchase of Philippine bananas for a while, and a lot of this also comes with the sort of more, I suppose, physical elements of coercion. So there's a lot of talk today, of course, about PRC military aircraft and ships going near Taiwan, increasing in number, and also sophistication in their operations. Well, we see this in the Yellow Sea, in the East China Sea, around the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, which are disputed with Japan, parts of the Yellow Sea with South Korea. And of course, very recently, we see very active PRC efforts to use their much larger Coast Guard vessels to prevent the Philippines from resupplying Second Thomas Shoal, this essentially maritime feature that the Philippines had beached one of their really old landing craft on, so that they can have maintain a presence on. There's constant friction between the PRC and Malaysia and Vietnam in areas of the South China Sea that each of these parties claim. So there's this sort of general effort to use pressure, along with other economic enticements, to get states to give in to PRC demands. I would also say that this is not limited to Southeast Asia, Taiwan, or Northeast Asia. You see pressure being put on Australia, a suspension of some of the trade there for their call to investigate the origins of COVID. You see pressure being put on Lithuania for trying to deepen their ties with Taiwan. So this is what we're seeing with Taiwan is part of this larger global phenomenon. It's not just Taiwan alone, although I think many people like to sort of isolate these sorts of incidents because maybe it's easier to understand the specifics, and maybe politically it's easier to sell, but I think there's a much broader linkage.
Speaking of PRC demands and pressure, as you said, Taiwan is in the spotlight, but it's not limited to Taiwan. We came across something that really caught our eye, was your recent paper on the many one Chinas. How does China use this, as different countries have different one China policies, to kind of force Taiwan or put pressure on Taiwan when actually most countries around the world do not abide by China's version of the one China principle, as countries have their own one China policy?
That bit is less directly coercive, but more the PRC trying to change the narrative around Taiwan in order to create a sense of greater acceptance, right, internationally, that Taiwan is supposed to be part of the PRC, even though they do not actually run governance on Taiwan. And so what that effort means is to create an impression that there is a lot of agreement, that there is a lot of consensus around this idea of the one China principle. This is something that China puts out. In fact, there's a really great paper by the diplomat, by a friend of mine from Academia Sinica, Wu Jianhui, and some of his co-authors that talk about this effort in more detail. So essentially, the effort, what we see Beijing try to do is to say that it's one China principle, which is that there's only one China in the world. Taiwan is part of China, and China is represented by the People's Republic of China, right? So essentially, it's a fusing of three things together: Taiwan, China, and the PRC. And the PRC, of course, is run by the Chinese Communist Party. Now, this is something that the PRC had been consistently trying to push other countries to accept. And this was especially the case when Beijing tried to establish formal, official diplomatic relations with various countries. But various countries have differing positions on their relationship with the PRC. They don't necessarily agree with the PRC on the need to sort of get themselves involved in what they see to be something that's at Beijing's insistence. So the way that historically this difference has been fudged is to talk about a one China policy that many states adopt. And the one China policies for different states look very, very different. Some, maybe about 51, because of their negotiations with Beijing, take on Beijing's version. But lots of other countries have a whole variety of things that will take note of Beijing's position or acknowledge Beijing's position, or sometimes not mention Beijing's position at all. So just to give you a flavor, the US one China policy acknowledges that Chinese on both sides of the strait, this is the Taiwan Strait, maintain that there is one China, and the US does not challenge that position. So what that means, that those terms are quite key, because acknowledge means to say that the US knows that Chinese on both sides of the strait say that there's this one China thing. They don't agree or disagree. They just say that, okay, we know that this position exists. And if you note from the U.S. original U.S. position, that sort of Chinese on both sides of the strait language, that is reflective of the time in which the U.S. One China policy was first formulated. So this would be at the early 70s, when the KMT, when martial law was still happening in Taiwan, where the KMT was in charge and Chiang Kai-shek was still alive. And for that regime, they insisted too that there was this one China which they were the legitimate representatives and government of. So that language has stayed. But of course, I suppose it is possible to debate what happens when identities change, if that affects things at all. But that's sort of looking forward a bit and gets a bit speculative. Just to give you a few more examples, if you look at, say, I think the Canadian position is that they take note, what I call sort of the German formulation, which is quite similar to the Singapore formulation. You have to actually follow the language a little bit carefully. So it says that they recognize that there is one China in the world, and Taiwan is part of China. And then the next sentence will say something like, they recognize the People's Republic of China. There's not that same link in the One China principle that equates China to necessarily the PRC. So there are various permutations of this, which I think essentially gives different states some leeway to manage their ties with both Beijing and Taipei. And within the One China policies that different states have, they have unofficial but relations with Taiwan at varying degrees of substance. So that's essentially the One China policies in the plural versus the One China principle. I'll also note that in terms of trying to shift the perception of Taiwan being accepted as internationally as being part of the PRC, there is also some move to push an interpretation of the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 2758. This was from 1971, when the PRC replaced the then ROC government's representatives at the United Nations. Now, that language, basically, you can look it up. This is all publicly available. You can look it up. It says that the UN will restore the seats to the People's Republic of China and will eject the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek. It does not mention Taiwan in the text at all. But Beijing today tends to claim that Resolution 2758 means to say that there's recognition that Taiwan is part of the PRC. That's just not in the text. So what all these point to is this ongoing effort to shift perceptions and understandings to strengthen Beijing's position and its claims over Taiwan, and to get more international support for that kind of a position.
Having said that, Ian, how do you think Taiwan should best resist such efforts, given Beijing's narrative and in convincing the world that Taiwan is a part of the PRC?
Well, I think Taiwan being able to act autonomously and make decisions for its own and make those decisions clear is very important. So the fact that you're having the presidential and legislative UN elections at the end of the year, and moving through your own process. That's important to be able to insist on Taiwan's own legal identity in international fora. That's also important. Although that does not at the same time necessarily have to connote statehood. So there are, I guess the PRC claim would be that, Hong Kong has a separate legal identity. But beyond that, I think it's also useful to sort of convey that, there are different one China policies out there in the world. And that may shape the way that Taiwan interacts with various governments, but that those policies are not the same as the one China principle. I think, at least on the substance, there can be a constant and consistent reminder to officials and perhaps media that, hey, when you work with Taiwan, you have to recognize the fact that even in your policies, Taiwan has this separateness, right? Has this distinctiveness that should not be treated as if it were just the PRC.
We understand that a core part of your current research is on post-authoritarianism polities and their ties with major security partners. Taiwan can also closely relate to that, obviously, as the country transitioned from a military dictatorship several decades ago. I'm wondering how you would compare Taiwan's experience to Southeast Asia and what needs to be put in place to safeguard decades of hard-won freedoms.
So the situation in Taiwan is going to be a bit different from a lot of Southeast Asia. There have been Southeast Asian states that have transitioned quite successfully away from authoritarian rule. Indonesia being one prominent example. I guess you can make a case for the Philippines as well. But I think for others, they're either still in the midst of transition or they still are sort of more ensconced in having authoritarian regimes. So in this regard, how Taiwan relates to these different entities, I think needs a little bit of care. So working with other democracies, other states that recognize democracy as a good, I think there an emphasis on the sort of common political values would be a useful thing to do. Talking about shared concern for things like human rights, including political and civil rights, will be important. However, migrant workers working on Taiwan owned and operated fishing vessels, that is a sore point. Now, for states that are not democratic and are more authoritarian, then this talk about democracy can actually seem threatening. So the focus there should perhaps be more about having a concern over environmental issues, perhaps labor issues, such that Taiwan is seen to be a partner and employer of choice, right? And that would create, I think, a lot of not just goodwill, but sort of substantive reason to actually work with Taiwan and Taiwan firms.
Thank you so much, Ian. That's fascinating. And thank you all for joining us on Global Voices on Taiwan. To ensure you don't miss out on exciting insights from this island nation's captivating stories, make sure to subscribe on your preferred podcast and social media platform.
Also check our full video on YouTube. Take care and see you soon.